In our theatre video, agency emerged in degrees. The audience might be acknowledged, they might be moved through a space, they might choose who or what to follow. But in Pervasive Street Games, the audience becomes the player. Their movement is not incidental. It is the mechanism through which the experience operates. Without them, there is no game. Games, of course, are not new. Human beings have always played. We've run races, thrown objects, chased one another, hidden, searched, competed, and invented rules to make ordinary actions more meaningful. Over time, many forms of play became formalised. They became sports with governing bodies, leagues, pitches, referees, cups, and professionals. But alongside this more organised world, another kind of play continued to exist. A looser, stranger, more experimental kind. Treasure hunts, street games, puzzle trails, live challenges, experiences that borrow from performance, from games, and from the spaces around us. Pervasive games grew from this territory. The term itself was used by researchers to describe games that push beyond the traditional boundaries of play, not just spatially, but sometimes socially and temporally too. In simpler terms, they are games that spill out into the real world, where ordinary places, ordinary time, and sometimes ordinary people become part of the experience. And this matters for our wider series because Pervasive Games take the agency we discussed in theatre and push it further. You are no longer just present in the same space as the work, you are physically moving through it. Your route matters. Your choices matter. Your actions are part of the experience. In traditional theatre, even when the form is being stretched, there is still usually an agreed space of performance. A theatre, a building, a warehouse, a room. Even immersive theatre tends to create a contained world that you enter and eventually leave. Pervasive Street Games work differently. They take the world that is already there and add a second layer on top of it. A familiar street becomes a route, a square becomes a checkpoint, a shop front becomes a clue, a park becomes a hiding place. Nothing has physically changed, but the way you read the environment has. The city has become a board game. And this is a subtle but powerful shift. In theatre, the set is designed for the story. In Pervasive Street Games, the story is designed around the environment. The real world doesn't just host the experience, it becomes it. It shapes it. This gives players a different kind of agency. You aren't simply choosing where to look inside a designed world. You are navigating a live, unpredictable place. Other pedestrians are moving through it. Traffic continues. Weather happens. The game world and the everyday world overlap. And that overlap is part of what makes these experiences feel so strange and often so memorable. One of the clearest examples of this is Pac-Manhattan, a large-scale urban game first created in 2004 by students at New York's University Interactive Telecommunications program. The concept was wonderfully simple. Take a familiar structure of Pac-Man and recreate it in the street grid around Washington Square Park in Manhattan. One player became Pac-Man, 4 others became the ghosts. Instead of moving through a digital maze on a screen, they ran through real city blocks. A team of controllers tracked the players and communicated their positions, effectively recreating the logic of the arcade game across a living, breathing part of New York. It's playful, and on the surface maybe even a little ridiculous, but it demonstrates something important. Pac-Manhattan doesn't need a fully constructed fictional universe. It doesn't need an elaborate script. Its power comes from taking a familiar game system and projecting it onto public space. Suddenly, the streets become corridors, intersections become turning points, a city grid becomes a maze. The agency here is immediate and embodied. You run, you hide. You make decisions in real time. The game exists because players physically enact it in the world. And it also reveals one of the defining qualities of Pervasive Street Games. They do not simply use the city as a backdrop, they temporarily change what the city means. As digital tools became more mobile, Pervasive Games began to stretch further. Portable devices, GPS, wireless networks, messaging systems, and later smartphones allowed experiences to become more responsive. A game could know roughly where you were, send you information, connect you to other players, or shift the experience experience as you moved. This technology matters because it allows the game to enter your journey at unpredictable moments. A call arrives, a message changes the task, a digital map reframes where you need to go. The real environment remains unchanged, but it is now laced with prompts, hidden instructions, and fictional possibilities. This is where pervasive games start to move even closer to immersive practice. The physical world is still real, but it is no longer neutral. It has been overlaid with a designed system. A particularly important example is Uncle Roy All Around You, created by Blast Theory, in collaboration with the Mixed Reality Lab at the University of Nottingham. First staged in central London in 2003, it described itself as a game in which the street players and online players collaborated to find the fictional Uncle Roy. Street players moved through the city carrying handheld devices. Online players navigated a parallel virtual version of the city and could guide, help, or mislead them. The street players searched for Uncle Roy's office, followed instructions, received messages, and gradually moved deeper into a narrative that blurred game, theatre, and reality. What makes Uncle Roy All Around You so interesting is that the technology is not the whole point. The game eventually leads players into a much more intimate and unsettling moment. They were invited to consider whether they would make a year-long commitment to help a stranger, and players who agree could be paired up with someone they do not know. This is a long way from Pac-Manhattan. Here, the city is not just a board. It becomes a psychological and social space. The experience uses movement, uncertainty, technology, life facilitation, and one-to-one encounter to ask something deeper about trust, obligation, and connection. And this is where pervasive street games begin to stretch beyond play in any simple sense. The player is still not acting in the way a performer acts. They are not necessarily role-playing as a character, but they are being placed inside a structure that asks them to make more meaningful choices. That choice may not change the entire narrative, but it changes their relationship to the work. It gives the experience a moral weight. It introduces a kind of agency that is emotional and social, not merely spatial. It is worth briefly mentioning ARGs, or alternate reality games, because they develop alongside this same broader history of play spilling into reality. ARGs often distribute a story across websites, emails, phone calls, social media, real places, and collaborative problem solving. They are less focused on turning streets into a direct game board and more focused on making fiction feel as though it has leaked into everyday life. The game doesn't always announce itself clearly. Players discover it, investigate it, and work together to uncover what is happening. This kind of boundary blurring is closely related to the wider logic of pervasive play, even when the format is not strictly a pervasive street game. I don't think ARGs need to be the centre of this video because their history opens up another whole branch of immersive culture, but they do help us to understand the wider shift. Across these forms, designers are experimenting with the same underlying idea. What happens when the edges of experience become harder to see? For much of their early history, pervasive games were experimental. They were created by artists, designers, researchers, and technologists working at the fringes of established formats. They often appeared through festivals, commissions, research programs, or cultural institutions. But over time, the same ideas began to appear in much larger systems. Mobile phones became universal. Mapping became embedded in everyday life. GPS no longer felt futuristic. And once these tools were in people's pockets, it became possible to build games that played out continuously across countries and continents. This is where our third example becomes important. In 2012, Niantic launched Ingress, a location-based mobile game in which players join one of two factions and compete for control of real-world locations, known in the game as portals. These portals were tied to actual places, public art, landmarks, historic buildings, monuments, and other culturally significant sites. Players walk through cities, towns, and rural areas to capture and link these portals, creating territorial fields that shift as teams compete. The game turns geography into strategy. A statue is no longer a statue. It becomes an asset. A route through town is simply no longer a commute. It becomes a tactical opportunity. What is significant about Ingress is not simply that it uses GPS. It makes ordinary movement meaningful inside a persistent, shared system. You aren't playing during a single booked event and then returning to normal life. The game sits there, invisibly layered onto our world, waiting for you to notice it again. This is a powerful expression of what researchers mean when they say pervasive games can expand the boundaries of play socially, spatially, and temporally. The play is distributed across real spaces. It connects strangers into teams and factions, and it continues over time rather than being contained within one clear session. Ingress also helped establish the model that Niantic would later use in Pokemon Go, where millions of players were encouraged to explore the real world with a digital layer placed over it. But Ingress is especially important in this history because it shows how ideas once explored in experimental artist-led pervasive street games could scale into something global. And at this point, it's worth making a distinction. Pervasive street games often borrow from theatre. They may use performers, characters, costumes, live facilitation, and narrative framing. They may also overlap with live-action roleplay, where players embody fictional characters and make choices from within those roles. But for the purposes of this series, we see pervasive street games as something slightly different. You do not necessarily have to become someone else. You do not always need to act. You often remain yourself, but are placed inside a design system that gives your actions a new meaning. You follow clues, you negotiate space, you respond to messages, you make decisions, you might collaborate, you might compete. But the core shift is this: you are not merely watching an experience unfold, you are helping it happen. And that takes the question of agency to a new place. For us at Yellow Brick, this is where our own practice began, making street games. We were interested in one simple question: what changes when people stop moving through a place as observers and start moving through it as participants? How can familiar spaces become playful? How can stories sit in real-world environments? How can movement, choice, and curiosity reshape how people experience the places around them? One of our early projects, Everwake, invited players into a city-wide mystery where Cardiff itself became part of the game. Participants moved through real streets, uncovering clues, solving challenges, and piecing together a larger unfolding narrative. Everyday spaces took on a new meaning. Routes through the city became part of the experience. Players were not simply receiving a story. Their movement through the environment became the mechanism through which the experience operated. Importantly, the experience did not begin and end at the event itself. We experimented with pre-experience content and post-experience materials that extended the story beyond playable moments, allowing narrative to stretch further into everyday life. Later, with Reverie, we pushed these ideas further by introducing technology that tracked player movement and responded to participants as they moved through space. Narrative could unfold in relation to where players travelled, creating a stronger relationship between story, place, and player behaviour. The city became both setting and system. Like Everwake, Reverie explored how experiences might bleed beyond their formal boundaries. Story elements existed before participation began and continued afterwards, creating the sense that the experience was not fully contained within a single timeframe or location. That idea that experiences can spill into ordinary life sits close to the heart of pervasive play, and projects like these shaped how we think about immersive work. Not immersion as technology, not immersion as spectacle, but immersion as participation, as frameworks that invite people to actively construct experiences rather than simply consume them. This is why pervasive street games matter in the wider conversation around immersion. They demonstrate that immersion is not only about impressive environments, detailed sets, or advanced technology. It is also about how a person is positioned within an experience. A game can be made immersive because the world around you has been reinterpreted, because your own route becomes part of the work, because the next instruction arrives when you are standing in a real street, because a familiar place is temporarily transformed through rules, fiction, and expectation. Pervasive games also reveal that agency does not always mean total freedom. Most of the experiences are still designed. They have rules, limits, structures, and intended outcomes. But within these boundaries, players make meaningful decisions. They generate the rhythm, the route, the tension, and sometimes the emotional force of the experience. That idea becomes hugely important for everything that follows in this series. When we later talk about immersive art, interactive installations, and game engine-driven environments, we'll come back to these same questions. Is the audience simply surrounded by a world, or can they affect it? Are they present, or are they active? pervasive? Are they inside an experience, or are they helping to produce it? Pervasive street games matter because they've offered early influential answers to these questions. They tested what happens when a public place becomes playable, when technology becomes a live dramaturgical tool, when audiences are no longer invited to sit still. They showed that immersion could happen not only by building a new world, but by changing how we encounter the world that we live in now. In the previous episode, theatre began to loosen the boundary between audience and actor. Pervasive street games take the next step. They loosen the boundary between experience and everyday life. The stage becomes the city. Audience becomes the player. The story becomes something navigated, solved, and lived through. And once an experience can unfold in the streets around us, immersion starts to mean something different. It is no longer about stepping inside a world that somebody has built. It is about discovering that the world that you're already standing in can be made to behave differently.